I wanted to talk about fetch, and I guess this is a much more beginner's topic rather than the other topics that people have talked about today. And I decided to call it a blessing in default, but then Lachlan suggested maybe so fetch. And apparently I'm the only person uh, in this group that probably didn't get the reference straight away. So I added a screenshot from the movie Mean Girls, if anybody doesn't know. I want to start talking about long methods, methods with long parameters lists. So for example, I gave an example here of a method that's called, that's print, and we are trying to like do some stuff, print some information about a user, and we passing in all the things. So first name, last name, email, phone, street, city, postcode. And this is a problem. So usually the rule for, so this is immediately like shoot, scream, a code smell. And the general rule is to not pass more than 3 params or 4 params. So I think Sandy Metz's 4 rules for coding says no more than 4 params, because the idea is usually if you pass so many things in that you probably have some object inside there that's hiding that you can extract and work with instead. The other problem that I have with this is that you have to pass those params in the order that you specify them with, and that can be problematic, and you're prone to having errors and problems. So a much better way to do is, for example, in this case, you can totally see like very easily that you have probably a user object and an address object. So instead that I will just pass them in and call stuff on them. And obviously there are problems in this approach as well, because now I am coupled to a user object that I have an expectation that it will respond to a method call, a method send that's called first name. So I now know a lot more about the user. But so there's pros and cons in this approach as well. But in any case, instead of just passing params, unless I pass a single param in, I actually prefer to use name params. So I will use a hash of parameters and I will pass my objects in. So in that way, when I'm calling them, I'm not tied into the order of the params that are specified one. And the second advantage of that is that it actually is a much better documentation of what the params that I'm passing in are. So it tells me that I'm looking for a user and I'm looking for an address when I pass those params in. Even better, like I can, in this case, like for example, I'm building a profile class and I initialize it with a user object, and then I delegate methods. I also assume that there's a join with an address. Again, there's a bit of coupling here, so this is a different discussion, a different topic. But if you're using Ruby, we can use the require affordable and then extend it, and then I can use a delegate user to address. If we are in Rails, we don't need to require affordable. We can just use delegate address to user, and we can define a prefix. We don't, by default, prefix is false. But if I do want to use a prefix, then I can pass in a prefix true, and then I can call user address.city, for example, in my print method. My problem is sometimes when we initialize classes and we do not set default. So this is, I was just doing an exercise a couple of days ago about resistor color trio. And in it, just as an example that I thought we can have a look, and in it I'm passing arguments, and the arguments that I pass in this case, I pass 3 colors for a resistor. And because Ruby doesn't have type checking, we need to do a lot of verification of the arguments that we get in. So in this case, there's only one check that I check that the colors actually exist. And as you can see here, like I'm already like, I don't know if the color that I'm getting in, if the value is actually a string or not. So I defensively convert it to a string and then work with that. But many times we can check if we have a file or if we are getting an integer because what we want to work with an integer or not. So we have a lot of validations across what we expect to get into our class and what we are working with. This is just one example of validation. So we might see in a lot of our Ruby classes, again, because we don't have type checking, and I'm not advocating for that because there's advantages to both, you will see checks for if some parameter is nil or if some parameter is present. If some parameters is integer, then do something, otherwise do something else. We can see also checks that if file name responds to path, then, you know, set it this way, unless the file is a string, that do it that way. So there's a lot of defensive validations in doing that. And instead, sometimes it's just easier to define the default, like in a config or settings object that Pat was talking about. I want to give a data example, and sometimes this is an example from Ruby Tapas by Avdi Grimm, and he gives an example of we require logger, and let's say we have an option hash and it's empty, and we want to set a logger, so we'll look at options to see if there's a logger in a options param, option hash, or set it to a new logger. So in this case, option hash is empty, so we get a default logger here. But however, if we set the logger to be false, so options logger is false, what do you think will happen here on line 15, line 14, 15? Anyone?
It'll use the logger.new.
Yep, and to make sure that is the case, let's have a look. Oh, no, wrong. Let's go to IRB, and let's actually, I'm gonna require logger first of all before we do that, and let's set that syntax error. I have, yeah, cool. So if I look at, let's see if I have my options. I have my options. Cool. Oh yeah, I didn't need line 12. And then that's my mistake. But then if we look, so we look at our options, and our options has logger set to false. And if I do this, I will still get a logger. I will not get the false being set. So that's problematic. And the problem that's happening here when we use OR with a hash for default values is that it can't differentiate between a missing key versus a key whose value is nil or false. So for example, we know that if we do this, we're gonna get, anyone?
Default.
Default.
Thank you. And again, if we do nil, we're gonna get default as well. If we do, which exactly like we did in the above example, if I'm looking for foo and foo doesn't exist, it will give me my default. But if I set foo to nil and then look for it, I will still get my default. And again, if I will set my foo to false, it will get me my default. Because basically, if we have, this is talking about true and false, but if we do this or that, we will get true, but it also works on the other side of the equation. Sorry. So a better way to use in this case is to use fetch. Now, if you're not familiar with fetch, it does, if a key exists, then it fetches the key. If the key doesn't exist, then it returns, it raises an exceptions for key error. And then if the key doesn't exist, then we can pass, and we pass in a default then it returns the default. So in contrast, fetch only resorts to the default when the given key is actually missing. So if we look at, so over here, option hash is empty. We're trying to fetch foo, it doesn't exist. And we say, when we pass in the block, it says this is a default value. So in this case, because I don't have a foo key, I will default to my default option. On the other hand, over here, if I do foo and I set foo to nil, and then I fetch foo, because foo exists, it will no longer execute what's in the block, and it will return nil. It will also do the same with false. So instead, I'm not going to get my my default logo, my default value. I will get the value of false. So it's a much better option. Now, on the other hand, if we have a look over here, and we didn't set a value, we didn't set a default value, and I'll try and fetch a key that is missing, I will get a key error, key not found foo, which again, usually if we have an option hash and we look for a key that doesn't exist, we will get nil. And sometimes that's an error that is silenced and we don't know, and then we need to check whether it's nil or not, and it's problematic. So having something like that raises an error is also more descriptive for me to know what keys this specific class or object are looking for. So that's an advantage by using fetch as well. So for example, to set default on fetch, if I go back to here, I can set the default like that. And because it doesn't exist, it returns default, or I can pass in a block. Either way, the difference between the two of these things is that in my first example here, if the default was a method that I'm calling with a very expensive operation, it will run anytime I call this. Whereas if I put that in a block, it will only run when the block is called. So there is some advantages to using blocks rather than defining a default within this fetch method. Now, where was I? So we have a couple of other examples. So parameters fetch, if I'm looking for an email, you can pass a key or a symbol, and I might be wrong with that. You can actually also raise a more descriptive error message, for example. And as I said, you can set the default either by a block or by passing a second argument to fetch. So in a previous local example, we would have been better off doing options fetch logger and otherwise passing the default as a block. Now, fetch also works on array, so it's not limited to hashes only. So on arrays, it behaves similar to a hash version, except that when the key is missing and no default block is supplied, it raises an index error instead of a key error. So for example, in my resisted trio example, if I have an array of a couple of colors and I've fetched the first one in the index, it finds it and it returns the value. On the other hand, if I try to fetch an index that doesn't exist in my array, it will return an index error instead of a key error exception. I wanted to talk, since we are talking about setting defaults, I wanted to give another example from Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby by Sandy Metz. And on page 136, she is specifying defaults by merging a default hash. So for example, she passes in arguments, but because all the examples in the book is about bikes and wheels and wheel sizes and chain rings, the example she gives is she sets the default in a separate method, and then she gets her arguments or params passed in to initialize, and then she merges them into default. and then looks for whatever she's looking for to set the individual value. So I thought it's worth mentioning another option. Now, if we are looking at some examples in the wild of when I was looking for fetch examples from a project that I worked on, like I think all of us have seen this example in Rails config file for environment. I had a class that we were caching associations that with another class, so it will be easier to search for the candidate that you were looking for. So in this case, we set, the default cache. For example, if you have a current user, but sometimes you don't, and you want to make sure that you do want to have like a user object to work with, and we don't have a current user in session at the moment, you might be able to see that we set the default one to guest user. The same works for null object pattern. If I'm looking for an address and I don't have one, and again, I don't want to check in my presenter whether, the address has a city, if city is present or not, I can just use a null address object and pass in as a default. And then I know that my null address will respond to all the same methods that I'm expect on an address class. We were working on emails, sending emails out to users. And we're working with candidates and hiring. Yes, Steve, this is about an application about hiring people. And in this case, the status was for wherever the candidate was in the funnel or in the process of being hired. So we were looking at whatever default message we would send them based on, where they are progressing in the process. And we will always have like as a default a missing status when we were trying to set the default text for an email. And again, you might see this for a pagination gem, or you can set if we have questions and I'm supposed to have a question hash, then I will set mine to an empty one by default, and so on. So just some examples in the wild from a project that I was working on. And I think this is me. Any questions?
Are there any times you wouldn't use fetch these days?
Sorry?
Are there any times you would not use fetch now?
I guess if I don't ever want to raise an exception, but generally I prefer fetch.
That was a good question.
Yes, you can provide a default on fetch. So the question was, does fetch on arrays let you provide a default? And yes, it does. So in my resisted trio example, the last black was a value of 0. And in a couple of examples, I passed in black as a default in one of my iterations, but in a different time, I actually used the default to raise an exception of argument error. And that worked as well with the specs in exorcism.